to Fragmented, a podcast where we capture what's top of mind for Android developers. I'm your host, Kaushik. As mobile developers, one of the most empowering feelings is taking an idea and turning it into a tangible app your friends and your family can use. For many of us, this inspiration was the reason we became Android developers, like the ability to just imagine an app and make it real. So, you wake up brimming with enthusiasm, you grab your coffee, and you open up Android Studio. But before you write a single line of code, you're hit with an avalanche of decisions. Should I use Jetpack Compose? Okay, sure. But which version? Which libraries? Do I use Material Design 3? Should I go with a single activity or multiple composable screens? Or maybe stick to fragments? Ugh. Then you think, okay, I need to hit an API for this idea. Should I use Retrofit? OKHTTP? Maybe Ktor? After wiring up all your dependencies, you realize, oh, wait a second, I actually need a JSON serialization library here. And then you think, wait, what about logging? I want to log these things and have that nice class tag every time you have those logs. Maybe I should add Timber. And just when you think you're making progress, it's time to navigate to another screen, right? Because, it's an app. What should I use? Well, all the cool kids are using Compose navigation with type-safe arguments today. I should probably configure that in as well. This decision paralysis is the quickest way to kill any inspiration that you might have. This is why I encourage everyone to create their own starter template. A set of pre-made decisions that just allow you to skip this whole busy work and jump straight to coding. Your starter template should have just enough to get you from idea to prototype with minimal friction. I recently created my own template called the Playground Android app. It's tailored just for my workflow and preferences, but it's not meant to be a universal solution for everyone. In fact, I urge you to create your own template. But by the way, this is actually not even a new concept, the whole starter template idea. Google has this thing called the architecture templates on GitHub. And no, it's not what you're thinking. This is different from the project templates that you see in Android Studio's wizard. You might ask, why have a separate thing? Google, typical, right? Well, my good friend Jose Alcerica, who wrote that blog post, has thought of this already. He knows you're going to ask this question and even added an FAQ in that post. Those templates that you're thinking about, they ship with Android Studio, so they follow a much slower cadence, right? Because it's only when Android Studio gets updated. These GitHub templates, on the other hand, you can update pretty quickly, and you even can use tools like Renovate or Dependabot that automatically take care of these dependencies for you. Anyway, here's my 2 cents on all of this. Build your own starter template. The process of creating one will teach you so much about the underlying tools and frameworks. This is what I noticed, by the way. I learned so many of these nuances that we can tend to take for granted sometimes. Secondly, experiment and innovate. A starter template is a perfect playground for just testing new ideas or tech, like that whole Compose navigation with type-safe arguments. I actually tested that, and I had to make it work in a multi-module setup, which is where I learned. I couldn't possibly imagine using this in one of the production apps at Instacart, for example. It's a much larger app. And lastly, get inspired by others. You don't have to do all the tedious work yourself. There are excellent templates out there. Again, I'll link those in the show notes. All right, I want to quickly give you a tour of my starter template and some of the decisions I've made for the playground. First, Gradle version catalog. This is the default standard, by the way, so that shouldn't come as a surprise. But what's slightly different in my template is that I really try to push the whole idea of having a single source of truth and this version catalog being that source of truth. So dependencies, SDK versions, Min SDK, Target SDK, Compile SDK, even the app's namespace, the version code, the version name, I just put all of them in my version catalog. The second thing, Gradle convention plugins. If you have more than one Android library module in your app, don't you find it frustrating that you have to repeat the whole thing, the JVM target, the plugins, KSP if you're using it, the library dependencies, build target, all of those things, Kotlin options. I have these plugins, these custom plugins set up so you can literally drop one line at the top of your build Gradle file, and you can just start writing code. So it reduces so much of the boilerplate that you otherwise have to write. And I'll be honest with you, some of this was an absolute pain in the ass to set up, but I have it locked down now, and hopefully I never have to figure this out again. Third in this list for my template, makefiles. I'm actually surprised more people don't use this. A makefile allows you to quickly run some handy commands from your terminal prompt. I use this especially for running very specific tasks while I'm building an app. For example, sometimes I just want to run my unit tests. Sometimes I want to build just my debug app and I don't want to run the lint task or any other dependencies. Here's another good one. Just nuke all my build folders. So clean all my build folders recursively. If you use KSP, there's even one handy command that kills the Kotlin daemon for you. And you can run a lot of these from Android Studio. Actually, I take that back. You can't run half these things that I mentioned from Android Studio directly. But the point is, when you get used to running these very specific tasks from your makefile, you just get so much more quicker than running through the entire cycle and running some of these unnecessary tasks. All right, fourth on my list, custom lint rules. We're starting to enter the nice to have territory, to be honest. I personally like it when I see a lint warning or error message that tells me, hey dummy, don't do that. There's a better way to write that code. So in my starter template, I've tried to collect a whole bunch of these really nice lint checks that some companies like Square, Slack, Uber, all of them use, and I put them in this template along with a few of mine. And I'm trying to build these, by the way, so if you have suggestions, send them over. Okay, now I'm moving into slightly advanced territory, which is really the list of things that you can choose not to have, but I've just made that choice and I like them. Multi-module support. From a lot of personal experience building large apps, I just don't want to deal with the future where I might have to extract each of these things into separate multiple modules. That is just such a painful process. So I have it set up so I can easily just add these modules now. And I even have a few examples that you can see. And again, speaking of advanced territory, dependency injection. You guys listened to my last episode, right? I for sure have both Kotlin Inject and Kotlin Inject Anvil integrated now. I also do this for a multi-module setup, which is something that you might not find too commonly online. So these are a bunch of things that I've added. I also have a few nice extras. I use Ktor for networking now. I have Compose navigation working with dependency injection, logging library in there. So a bunch of nice extras that you folks are welcome to look at. And honestly, each of these choices deserves its own episode, if I'm being honest, which I'll definitely try to follow up on so I can give more choices and the details. Stepping back, even with this starter template, setting up a project today still feels like more work than it should be, honestly. I was recently reading this post from an online friend and an Android developer, Ayuri Souza, who, by the way, is a phenomenal thinker in the Android developer space. Go follow him if you don't already. So Ayuri starts the case that Kotlin DevX, or developer experience, is not great. It's especially in some of the things we're talking about. He draws the comparison to technologies like Python, Ruby, Rust, and even JavaScript, where they have things like poetry, Ruby gems, cargo packages, node modules, etc. They all give you a very nice, isolated, deterministic environment where you can just get up and going quickly. Android development sorely lacks that. But Ayuri says there's hope. There's a new tool from JetBrains that's in super early stages called Amper. Amper is a project configuration and build tool with a focus on the user experience and the IDE support. This is from their description, by the way. And it looks super, super interesting. Well, this is a podcast following the zeitgeist of Android development. So I decided to ask probably one of the most knowledgeable people on the subject, who's also an amazing thinker in the Android developer space. I want you to welcome Martin Brown.
So I'm a developer advocate at JetBrains, where I work on a lot of Kotlin-related things. So that includes Kotlin multi-platform, Compose multi-platform, the related IDE tooling, and all of those things.
One specific tool that you've been working on, and you've seen some very interesting blog posts from your side, is Amper. What is the elevator pitch for Amper?
So Emper is a new build tool that we are working on, which aims to simplify all of the problems around build configuration. It's, of course, built with Kotlin multiplatform in mind from day one, as multiplatform is something that we clearly care deeply about. Mostly, we just wanted to, get out of your way so that you can focus on the rest of your project. And then one of the big things about it is that it's a declarative build description, so it's going to be very toolable as well.
Actually, can you quickly touch on that? There is this concept of an imperative style of configuring your app and a declarative way, right? Can you maybe briefly touch on that?
Yeah, so by declarative, we mean that everything that you describe in Emper configuration is built on a fixed schema so that we can easily parse it. It can't have things like if statements or for loops, so no dynamic behavior like that. And that lets us evaluate what your build configuration is much easier and much quicker. And if we ever need to add additional configuration based on tooling like quick fixes in the IDE, or if we need to modify a value for you in your configuration, then thanks to the declarative approach, there's always going to be just a single way to do that. So we can make very confident edits to help you easily configure your build.
This is interesting. It's sort of a tectonic shift from the world of Gradle, where using a programming language to configure your build gives you more tooling and power and support. Do you think that's like a U-turn that we have done just because of how complex that can get? Or no, it's just a different, better approach, you think?
I think there's pros to both. Of course, it depends on how much you want to invest into learning all of these systems and how much really complex custom behavior your specific project needs. But we do think that for a lot of projects, the freedom that an imperative language and the complexity that comes with it, so that might not be actually required for a lot of people's like normal builds.
So one of the biggest challenges that I was talking about with the listeners was how tedious it is to set up an Android app today, right? So if I conceive of an idea, if I think of an idea, and I just want to get started and, work on the app and have something that I can quickly work on without having to worry about 100 decisions in the process. What version I'm using, what Android version, what Kotlin version. It's not a very pleasant process today. Is Amper specifically aimed at changing that aspect of it, or did it stem from a different idea altogether?
That's certainly part of it. So we're looking at both newly created projects and then working with projects over time. And for new projects, we have, I think, already a very exciting and very quick onboarding flow where you can start building the project from a single file if you want. We'll help you all the way from literally one empty folder as you write your first line of build configuration. We'll give you quick fixes to configure the basics of your project. We'll give you auto completion all around as you are setting up your build. We have a couple of small templates if you want to choose from common scenarios like I want a KMP library or I want an Android app. We have some brief file templates for that. So yeah, we definitely care a lot about people quickly being able to bootstrap a new project without having to necessarily even click through a wizard or something like that.
One of the things I noticed when reading the FAQ for Amper is you are required to use IntelliJ's latest version or even Fleet, geared at the whole Kotlin multi-platform thing, I'm guessing. Is there a CLI version similar to how some of the other languages like maybe Python or one of these other languages use?
It depends on what you're looking to do through the CLI, but in general, there is absolutely a CLI version of Emper, both for creating new projects if you want to, and as well as for running just build tasks. So like building your project, running your project, these are all things that you can do with command line tasks as well with Emper.
Interesting. So in theory, I wouldn't have to I can just use any IDE, say Android Studio, whatever version of Android Studio I'm using. I can still use that and independently also use Amper on the side?
Yes, that would work. Although for actually editing the files, you would want the IDE support that we are building, because that's a lot of where the value and the power of Emper comes from, that it has, of course, first-class IDE support.
Switching gears a little, in contrast, other platforms like, say, Python have, Poetry or PIP, and, they have virtual environments. JavaScript has node modules and, the host of other things that comes with it. Ruby has, Ruby environment, RBE and V, gem files. Even Golang at this point has modules. The advantage with these tools is there's a sort of sandbox mentality or, a deterministic nature with, log files and different things where you can be sure that if I have this environment working, I know it can translate to another environment and work well. There are caveats with it, but is that something that's also a goal for Amper? Will Amper also be aimed at an approach like that where you can just deterministically pick your different toggles of versions and then be off to the races?
So in general, I think we can say that we are looking at a lot of different ecosystems and build tools for inspiration for Amper. So the team that's working on Amper is doing a lot of research behind the scenes. As we are shipping updates around once every 2 months or so, that's maybe half of the work that actually goes public. And in the other half, they are doing behind the scenes research on a lot of aspects of how to do a build system right and what exactly we want to achieve. So that includes looking at all of these different ecosystems and build systems and the languages they use for configuration and all of that. As for the environment management aspect specifically, we do have some things here already. So we do try to do things like set up your SDKs for you automatically. I can't really comment off the top of my head on the exact things that we already do and what are in the plans, but we would like to see a future here where once you grab an Amper project, if you don't have a JDK installed yet, if you don't have the Android SDK and it includes an Android build, things like that, that Amper itself could help you get set up with the environment for a lot of the configuration pieces of that.
Looking at the docs, it almost feels like it's too good to be true, building on what you said, right? For example, specifying the Kotlin version, and I was just telling you this, when we were chatting outside, I spent yesterday night almost like an hour trying to figure out how to get this deprecated JVM target version to a newer version that, Gradle now recommends. It's just a lot of meta work that doesn't need to be done, But in some cases, those are very explicitly chosen, right, for functionality. So there's a lot of nuts and bolts with the specific Android Gradle plugin version you're using, the specific JVM target for your Kotlin version, the Kotlin version itself. How do we think about that with Amper? Briefly reading at the docs, it feels like Amper starts off and, like you just mentioned, making some of these choices for you, right? Like pick a good set of defaults and then proceed. But is the thought process also to allow the whole nuts and bolts version of this?
At the moment, Amper has a lot of hard-coded defaults. So things like the Kotlin version, we just bump that in Amper releases every once in a while. So if you go to a newer version of Amper, you might get a newer version of Kotlin. But we are also opening up certain things for customization because we see that there are real use cases and real demand for that. For example, one of the things we allow customization for is the Compose version, because we do have a sane default setting for it. But there are people who already want to try the pre-release RC version of the next major version of Compose, for example. So we've opened that up for customization. I know in the latest release, we also opened up the Kotlin X serialization version for customization because we figured that the library part of that can be decoupled from the actual Kotlin version. Whether we are going to open up everything in the long term is difficult to say. There is something very nice about having strong opinionated defaults. And versioning in the entire ecosystem, both on Android itself and then in the KMP ecosystem, is something that I think we all think a lot about, both as users of the ecosystem and as the people building it. So we are obviously trying to make all of that better.
You mentioned versioning, and I couldn't help but think about, Gradle version catalogs and, how that was just a somewhat recent move that everyone has made. I also could have sworn I saw that in the Amper docs there was talk about working with version catalogs. Can you speak a little to that?
Yes. So Emper has two versions, which I think we have to get to at this point to explain it. We originally built Emper as a Gradle plugin so that it sits on top of a regular Gradle build as a configuration layer. That was a great way for us to get up and running quickly and start validating some of the ideas of Emper and giving it to users. And then in parallel to that, we also have a standalone version of Emper, which is a standalone build tool, and it only invokes Gradle if it really has to. So for example, for Android builds, we always need the Android Gradle plugin still. So for certain parts of the build, Emper would call into Gradle as part of an Emper build. So we have these two different versions of Emper. And in the Gradle-based version, we built out support for Gradle version catalogs. So in your Emper module configuration files, you could refer to entries from a Gradle version catalog. And it's actually a very nice experience because both of these files are fully declarative. So we can see changes in them and parse them in real time, pretty much. So you're editing a TOML file and a YAML file. So if you add something new to a catalog, you don't need to resync your project or anything because we can just read it instantly and auto-completion will immediately show the new dependency on the module config.
Oh, nice.
So we have that kind of support, which is also great if you're migrating a Gradle project to Emper, for example. Like you can do that piece by piece. So we have that kind of interop and partial migration support as well. And then in the standalone version of Emper, we also support the same format of Gradle version catalogs, but we are also doing more research in this area to see what an Emper version catalog might look like. So we might want to do a different format, but I mean, very similar ideas, a centralized place for all of your dependencies, versions, that sort of thing.
Oh, that's fantastic, because one of the questions I was going to follow up on is it felt from the early days Emper was built on top of Gradle, but you've made that clear. That was more for an experiment approach to quickly see how people take to it and what can be
done. and it's great for the migration scenario as well. If you want to move between the two, it's great because that version has interop. So if something is not built yet for Emper, you can use a build Gradle file next to your Emper configuration file. So if you want to add a compiler plugin that we don't have set up in Emper yet, then you can just add Gradle configuration next to your Emper config. So you get interop support like that. And at this point, we don't have specific plans of abandoning the Gradle-based version. We are really looking for user feedback, which is actually the entire story of Emper at the moment. We really want everyone to try it and give us as much feedback about what they would like to use of this, what they think, what they're missing. So we're doing a lot of work collecting feedback, real life use cases, and trying to build something that people actually want. So that Gradle-based Emper support is one of these things where we want to hear if people want us to keep that around at the same time when the standalone version exists.
I won't put you in the spot and ask you when is Emper becoming stable. So instead I'll ask you this question. Can I use Emper today to build an Android app? Would you suggest I use it?
It depends on what you mean by building an Android app. We don't recommend using it in production, but we would certainly love for you to try it. So if you have a pet project where it doesn't matter if you break things or if some things are a bit hacky because you need like interop or workarounds or something like that, or if you have just a separated branch of your main projects perhaps where you want to try to see what configuration with Emper might look like, we would love for you to try that. But the project is currently experimental, which means that we might break anything about it at any time. So we don't want anyone to run their business on top of Emper at the moment.
Thank you so much for joining us on the show. If folks want to follow some of your good work or even give you feedback about Emper, what's the best way to do this?
So for feedback, I want to point everyone to the Kotlin Lang Slack for the most part, where we have an Emper channel, which of course has the team in there so they can answer any questions. You can also find me, of course, on the Kotlin Lang Slack. And I mean, with the recent migrations of everyone going to Blue Sky, I think that might be a good place to ping me and follow me at the moment.
Perfect. I will add links to all of that in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, Martin.
Thanks again for having me.
Okay, folks, it's time to wrap up. Start building your own starter templates today. Keep an eye on Emper. It could change the way we start projects. But most importantly, focus on reducing friction. The quicker you get from idea to code, the better. As always, thank you so much for listening and for your support. I'll catch you in 2 weeks on the next episode.